Hello and welcome to The Perspective. I'm your host Rafae Iqbal, and in today's show we'll be discussing Pakistan's relationship with the IMF, and in that regard the staff level agreement that has just been reached between Pakistan and the IMF, which is a major development in Pakistan's economic sphere. Of course, in that regard we know that the finance minister Mohammad Aurangzeb, he earlier had presented the budget in the parliament, which has also been adopted now. And the finance bill has come into effect. He hinted at major economic reforms in this budget, such as the reforms in the tax sector, and of course how the government wants to facilitate different sectors like agriculture and IT. And the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has also time and time reiterated of these tax reforms which the government is going to undertake now, which calls for major reforms in the FBR, the Federal Board of Revenue, such as digitizing the whole FBR system. And of course, in that regards, Islamabad sought to secure an extended fund facility from the IMF worth $6 to $8 billion. In that regard, there's been a major breakthrough as a $7 billion staff level agreement has been reached between Pakistan and the IMF. In regards to these talks that were being held regarding the extended fund facility, the IMF also held virtual meetings with the provincial governments, and they also laid down some demands such as imposing taxes on salaries more than 600,000 a year, or taxes on the agriculture sector. These are the different aspects of Pakistan's staff level agreement that has been reached with the IMF, and of course we'll be exploring the different dilemmas of this agreement and of course how it's going to impact Pakistan's economy. In the studios we've been joined by Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, former ambassador to the World Trade Organization. Along with that, we've been joined by Daniyal Sheikh, who is a political analyst. And on Skype, we have been joined by Dr. Usman Chohan, who is a senior economist. I'd like to thank you all for your time and being part of the conversation. I'd like to start off with Dr. Manzoor Ahmed first. Considering the economic situation in the country, the Pakistan Stock Exchange, it is at an all-time high. There's many positive indicators as well, such as the rupee being pretty stabilized as of now. But with the extended fund facility that the finance minister has been talking about for quite some time now, how do you think it's going to affect Pakistan's economy in the short term? And how do you think the government can utilize this fund productively in the long term?
Well, I think one, to build on the stability that we have achieved so far and not be on the verge of default or something, something like that. So build on that first. But then do those reforms for which they have committed. For example, 2 or 3 examples that I can give you, but maybe later on. One is this: they're sinking a lot of money in the state-operated enterprises. They have to privatize, reform, whatever they do. Right. So that is one thing. The other big area of reform is energy sector, where there is a big hole, there's circular debt, the prices are going through the roof. So they have to do something about the energy sector. And the third major area is taxation, because already I think this time they're expecting about 40% jump. That's a huge over next year. So these are some of the things, but as we go along, I could speak about some other things.
Definitely, I'll come to that as well. And privatization, the energy sector, and taxation, of course, these are the highlights of what Pakistan's economy is being focused on by the finance minister as well at the moment. I'll move towards Dr. Usman Chohan and ask you, how do you think with the IMF's demands regarding the agriculture sector, whether they want to impose taxes on the agriculture sector, and the government has earlier talked about how the agriculture sector has been performing exceptionally well. Do you think the government has also talked about how it wants to facilitate the agriculture sector? With that, do you think the government can balance how it wants to facilitate certain sectors with the IMF's demands?
This is a very good question. In the press release by the IMF, they have certainly focused on agriculture as one of the sectors that needs to be brought in line for a fairer and simpler tax regime. So agriculture is the largest sector in terms of employment, but its productivity is not particularly high by world standards. You are correct that the agricultural sector has had a few good years, but overall the yields in our agricultural sector are not particularly high. Labor productivity is low, mechanization is weak, and then there are climate related issues involved as well. So the government has to keep in mind, above all, the small farmer. In order to do that, we have to look at the size of land holdings, how agriculture is organized in every province, and then get a fair deal for the farmer, squeeze out the middleman, and then make sure that we have enough food security as well as exports. This is a delicate balance, as you can infer. And I think that the government does understand the prioritizations, but there are vested interests in the agricultural sector that have to get out of the way for it to be brought into the tax net. But having your largest labor pool outside the tax net seems quite ridiculous now, and the IMF is insisting on having agriculture as well as retail as well as export sectors brought into the tax net so that it's not just the salaried class that is squeezed.
Definitely. Daniyal Sheikh, what's your views on how do you think with the balancing IMF's demands with taxing the agriculture sector, it's going to bring the burden on the small farmers as well as those entities that are into corporate farming. How do you think it's going to cope up with the small farmers in the country?
Well, obviously the small farmers, they're already quite squeezed when it comes to their resources. Most of them have to take loans during the when they start their to grow their crops. Some of them even have to take loans from people, and it's very they're already squeezed. So I don't think it's obviously a very bitter pill that they have to swallow. But on the other hand, I guess we don't have a choice. We're in a situation that we have to take this measure, otherwise there's nothing we do.
Right, definitely. Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, when we talk about the agriculture sector, there's the small enterprises. If we look at the sector as an industry, there's the small enterprises such as the farmers, and then there's the bigger enterprises such as those that are into agriculture, into production, as well as refining, who own the flour mills, sugar mills, and such and such. Do you think it would be better if all of the players in the agriculture sector are taxed evenly, or should the government have some kind of a policy to facilitate the smaller farmers, meanwhile taxing the bigger industrialists?
I think there is going to be an exemption below a certain level, so the normal small farmer will not be, they'll be exempt.
Right.
I mean, it's like, paying income tax. So below a certain limit, you're exempt. So it will be more or less something similar. So they want to get the big, and this agriculture farming, there was another problem. That many big industries, they were using it for money laundering. They were showing it as income from agriculture, so they don't have to pay that tax, and in fact earning from here. So
Right.
it's the main target is those big farmers.
Right. And when we talk about the agriculture sector and how the productivity and yield can be increased, do you think the government should focus on human resource development in the agriculture sector as well, so corporate farming can be introduced into our local systems?
Yes, that is to a certain extent that's already happening. And then there's a lot of new funding coming in,
Right.
from Saudi Arabia and from UAE and others, for all these things, for improvement of seed, for mechanizing the tilling, etc. So yes, that is the plan, that because already this year, I think the export earnings were about 7-8 billion. So they want to build on that, so that
Right.
agriculture, whatever excess, and it doesn't mean that they're depriving the locals, but it's also increases the income of farmers. When it's export, if it's everything is here, then the prices will go down.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And Mr. Daniyal Sheikh, you
Yes,
would
I
like
would
to
just like to add, like you said about the human development. More than that, I think it's also very important that the government should facilitate small farmers to buy tractors and other equipment. Like in my village, even today, they're using their bulls to plow which is a very conventional method, and it's very inefficient. And secondly, especially from my area, I can tell you, because we have the river Sindh, it crosses our village. So I think that if some kind of a solar subsidy on tube wells or water pumps is given, a lot of land which is not being cultivated, it can easily be cultivated, and this is something that the government should definitely
Well,
look
the
into.
government has, Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has announced that they will convert the agricultural tube wells across the country. They've already done it in Balochistan, they've started doing it, but they want to do it all across the country. In that regards, Dr. Usman Chohan, do you think the government needs to balance between subsidies and taxes when it comes to the agriculture sector, so it can create a balance where there's an environment where the business can also flourish in the agriculture sector, but there's also enough tax collection?
Absolutely. I think this is a very important point. There's a fundamental set of mismatches in our economic structure. One of them is between revenue and expenditure. That's one that you're alluding to. And the other one is between subsidies and growth. So natural growth or competitive growth versus having the state get involved. So on the revenue versus expenditure side, certainly we have to take a much more sober look at where our expenditures go. And that is not just for the federal government, because a lot of pressure is put on the federal government to handle a federation which has huge federating units. The provinces, are the spending units, and the federation is the one that is expected to collect the revenue. This fiscal federalism is very, very unbalanced. So I believe that our provinces need to be put on a very tight leash in terms of their expenditures, and also that they raise their own revenues. Thankfully, this is something that has been brought up in the IMF press release, that it will be on either agriculture tax, which you have mentioned, as well as property taxes is something not mentioned that I believe is important at the provincial level. And on the second thing, well, the IMF has said in its press release that you have to remain committed to subsidy reform, and you have to replace cross subsidies to households with direct and targeted things. So I think this is a very good point, that it is important to help our downtrodden classes, but it has to be done in a targeted and optimal manner. Already our programs have the potential to be very, very optimal, if not entirely optimal, very, very good. And at the same time, we don't want to have any extra rent seeking or other distortionary behaviors that extract some sort of surplus from income transfer programs. So what I'm saying is that you have to be efficient about it, and that it is important to have subsidies that are targeted. And at the same time, you take a good look at your expenditure, but that's not a federal issue. It's also a provincial issue.
Definitely. Dr. Manzoor, in light of what Dr. Usman had to say when we talk about taxation in regards to the provincial and federal relationship, the provinces have assured the IMF that they will cooperate in regards to the tax collection that the IMF wants. How do you think this is going to work out, and how do you think, is it a good omen for the country's economy?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, look at any other federation anywhere in the world. So a lot of taxation comes from the provinces. Unfortunately, here previously, I mean, you know, it was more centric. I mean, you know, it was in capital. You know, they collect everything, give it to them. So they were, for years they were used to it. But I think they are now devolved. Whatever was devolved, they want to hand over to the provinces. So the provinces in this IMF, they've been asked to spend more money on health, on education, and collect more taxes, as just mentioned, property, but it's not just property, but other taxes that you know, services, etc.
Indirect taxes.
Yeah, indirect taxes as well as direct taxes.
Right.
You know, so both, and so the province's share is going to go up compared to where it was previously. Previously, they were hardly contributing anything.
And when we talk about that, do you think it's going to make the tax collection whole procedure more efficient for when the governance structure is going to be dissolved to the province?
You see, when they have the responsibility to raise taxes, so they'll be a little more careful about how they spend it. For the time being, you know, whatever the federal government gives for education, so they build, you know, many universities and hiring more teachers, etc. So they'll be a little more careful about their spending.
Right, definitely. Daniyal Sheikh, when we talk about the extended fund facility, of course, there's the economic aspect of that, how we want to facilitate our economic revival, and then there's the aspect of a public welfare, and of course it's going to be done through the Benazir Income Support Program. How do you think this program can help in human resource development? So so the fund is not being just utilized for social welfare, but also to provide them with the skills and human resource development so they can contribute to the economy as well.
I'll just come to that in a moment. Like we were talking about the provinces, the responsibility of the provinces. One thing I would like to add, a few months ago I was reading an article, one of the biggest defaulter of KESC was Sindh government. So the provinces also have to start taking the responsibility for paying their, not just collecting tax, but also paying for their expenses. Because according to our constitution, for the emergency expenses, like for the hospitals or the police stations, the federal government cannot cut their electric supply, but they have to be more responsible and start paying their bills on time. Now coming to the point, yes, recently during this budget, I was going through the government's program. Yes, they have a plan to start giving vocational training, especially to women in the urban and the rural parts of Pakistan. So that could definitely start small cottage industries, and they could become, because otherwise giving them money is just counterproductive and it's just causing inflation. You're just printing money and giving it to people, so it's no real time value. So definitely therefore the government is focusing on it, and I'm quite hopeful we'll start seeing results.
And do you think public-private partnerships for the human resource development, they would prove more effective?
Oh, most certainly, because there's a lot more check and balance when it comes to, and secondly, obviously whenever, like we were talking about the state-owned enterprise, the reason why they have failed is because it's very difficult managing, it's not the government's job, you know, we have realized that it's not the more efficient way of running any enterprise is the private sector. So similarly, when you want to, even when you want to distribute some resources, or you want to educate people or give them skills, whatever you want to do, if private companies are doing it and they're competing each other for it, so it's going to be a lot more efficient compared to if the government is doing it. Because obviously there's no check and balance there's no check and balance of that sort in the public sector as there is in the private sector. Because if you don't work efficiently in the private sector, you get fired the next day, but in the government sector there's a long process. So definitely this is going to show us good results.
Right, definitely. And Dr. Usman, when we talk about how the government's focused on economic revival and the steps being taken to ensure that, at the same time, there's then creed for tax reforms, and not just the agriculture sector, the overall in all the sectors of the country. With regards to that, what role do you think the private sector and the small and medium enterprises can play in the country, as Daniyal Sheikh also mentioned, of giving the people skills so they can start their cottage industries? So when in light of that, do you think when the people who want to have their own startups, the government should facilitate them in some way? Of course, there's going to be taxes on them as well. But the private sector and the SMEs, do you think the government facilitating them would also significantly contribute to our economic revival efforts?
You've posed an excellent question, because the answer is both, that the government has to be more intrusive and at the same time it has to be less intrusive. And what I mean by that is that it has to be more intrusive in terms of facilitation and in terms of the rule of law and supporting the little guy. So making sure that things are transparent and work well, and make sure that injustices in the system, like things that, wrongdoing amongst private parties, enforcement of contracts, that sort of thing, it has to be very strong in terms of rule of law. But at the same time, it has to be less intrusive. And what I mean by that is that there is a particular reason why we don't have champion large industries like other Asian countries have, and that has to do with the government's footprint, which is to say that it overregulates and it overtaxes large-scale things. So you are never really motivated to scale up your business. You're better off having a reasonable footprint in Pakistan and then probably expanding abroad. So the government has to get out of the business of overregulating and overtaxing that demotivates or disincentivizes scale. But at the same time, the government needs to do a much better job in terms of judicial performance in the economic area, or in terms of enforcing contracts or rule of law or those sorts of things. So it has to do the opposite of what it's doing, paradoxically. So less intrusive and yet more intrusive.
Dr. Manzoor, what's your views when we talk about the economic revival efforts? Of course, the government wants to facilitate the sectors that can contribute to quicker revenue generation. With regards to that, the extended fund facility that we have had a staff level agreement for is going to be for 37 months. With that, do you think what sectors the government can identify that can contribute to quicker revenue generation? Like they say, the IT sector contributes significantly, and Pakistan has been exporting a lot and getting a lot of money from the IT sector. But do you think the government can further polish it so it can contribute more?
Sure. IT, sky is the limit. You know, just compare next door India exporting something like $200 billion of software. And this year we are very happy, but there's still 3.5 billion. So we have a long way to go. And the government can support it because you see, if you make anything, say you make a machinery, a car, air conditioner, something, about 70 to 80% of that material is imported, and then you add value. But in case of IT, I mean, you have a lot of manpower. So if they're properly skilled, we don't really need to import anything, because you just need to have computers, you know, and once you import it, that can go on. So the output is far more, the value addition is far more, and this shortage of foreign exchange. This is, and we have been in these low value products, textiles and these things, you know, the making towels and things. We have to move on. We have to move on. IT, pharmaceuticals, these things which can fetch us a lot of money, and you know, we don't have to import a lot of things to export those things. So these are the kind of things that they can do.
Right, and when the government says it wants to facilitate a sector, when we talk about facilitating the IT sector, do you think there should be subsidies, like if a student wants to buy a laptop, he should have installments that he can pay or that he can afford easily? Do you think the government should take measures on the grassroots level for this?
First, well, subsidy is secondary, but the first thing is government can exempt these things from tax, you know, import duties, because the whole world, they're not taxed, because there's an international agreement they called Information Technology Agreement, right, that requires that you don't tax them. Unfortunately, in Pakistan we do, and that is our big problem, because the access problem. And especially, you know, it's well, you can have people in Islamabad, etc., who have smartphones and this, but you have to see the rest of the country. The digital divide is growing. So the very first thing government should do is get rid of these taxes, which nobody else charges, but we in Pakistan charge. And then obviously, so, you know, because there are lots of other things they do, and why not this? Deserving cases, they already have these laptop schemes, etc., but they need to ramp up. I mean,
definitely. Daniyal Sheikh, what's your views when we talk about the private sector?
Before that, you were talking about the IT sector. That's definitely something that if the government invests in, they can see a lot. They can see quick results, because the human brain, the capacity is same globally, more or less. For other industry, you need a lot of natural resources. You need a lot of other external factors that contribute. In this, relatively, all a smart brain and a laptop, that's all you need, and you can start generating some sort of activity and generate revenue for the country. So I definitely think that the government should invest in IT. That is something that with very minimal effort we can get a lot more results. And what was the other question?
Regarding the private sector, what role do you think, and what sectors do you think the private sector can contribute in? There's a lot of foreign direct investment coming in. The government has talked about mines and minerals, a lot of other sectors. But when we talk about foreign direct investment coming in, do you think the projects that are being started should be more centric on how they create employment opportunities for the people here as well?
Well, I think at the moment, economic jobs is a byproduct. Which is more important is to get that investment at the right place. For example, like you talked about the mines and minerals. So that is definitely, so you see, if the revenue is coming into the country, then creating jobs for the government is not difficult, or the other sectors will, they can do it. Our agenda of focus should be to somehow get our share of the global pie of that resources, rather than focusing on employing a lot of people. But the reason why all these state enterprise failed was we were just trying to employ people. I don't think that should be the focus. The focus should be to get revenue in, because once you have the money, finding employment for people is not difficult.
It's great that you mentioned state-owned enterprises. Dr. Usman, what's your views regarding the privatization? It has been talked about many times. It has been talked about early in the past as well, but this time there seems to be like there are more concerted efforts for that. How do you think a privatization of the state-owned enterprises can play in Pakistan's economic revival efforts? Dr. Usman, can you hear us?
Proceeding. Yes, I can.
Yes, please continue.
Thank you. It's very important to monitor how our privatization efforts are going because they are important on two fronts. One is that the proceeds of our privatization sales should help to supplement or bolster our reserves. The second is that we have to look at the efficiency and how they are doing work, and they're not doing it particularly well overall, but that's a general statement. There are some that contribute a lot of value. The thing is that our finance minister has said that there are no sacred cows, and we have to take a good look. It's not the business of government to be an enterprise, it's the job of enterprise to be an enterprise, and he is correct. Now, in terms of how they're going, the proceeds seem to be small, incipient, but they are supposed to increase. It also depends on the overall macroeconomic climate that you would have international and local buyers for these things. And I think that as interest rates are going down around the world, there will be more appetite for purchasing assets, particularly ones that are high yield assets or strong productive assets that would have been better under better management with fewer people, less politicization. So a lot of these assets can be put in the private hands or in public-private partnership that would do a better job. But the footprint of the government has become so large over the last 60 years that I think it's good overall to do it. Now you have to make sure that you get a good deal for it, and that once you do sell it off, keep an eye on them to see how they're doing, because you'd be surprised at how well some of them do, and you might be surprised by how poorly others do in private hands. It's just a mixed bag, I forecast.
Right, Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, your views on privatization of the state-owned enterprises. Of course, it is something that has been talked about a lot, but there's been a lesser action on that. But this time around, the government seems more determined.
Yes, I think so. They made good progress on privatization of PIA and steelways. But now I think in this IMF agreement that they said also that not only the loss-making, but even the profit-making should privatize them, because they could easily run into losses.
Right.
So I think there's very intense work going on privatization. It
Right.
takes time because the requirements are so many. But already I think we see by the end of August, PIA, they've invited the bids, etc. They're going through that process, and so it's making progress, I think.
Well, and the PIA's stocks, their shares in the PSX, they have gone up since the whole privatization process began. With regards to that, do you think when we talk about, as the IMF has mentioned, all of the state-owned enterprises, not just the loss-making ones, do you think it's a good omen for all of those independent organizations?
Well, if the economy is okay, stabilized, then perhaps the government can get better prices. But if the buyers feel that the economy is going down and they might go bankrupt, then nobody wants to pay. But if the economy has already stabilized, and as you see from the stock market, they see the stock market indication that the economy will be performing better. So because of that, I think they should be able to get better prices for the state-owned enterprises.
Dr. Manzoor, could you also highlight the significance of the stock market? The finance minister has talked about this over and over again, that the stock market's performance is exceptionally well in a country's economy. Before, Shamshad Akhtar, it was not being focused on as much, but after we saw Ms. Shamshad Akhtar in the finance ministry, we saw significant impacts being made for and efforts being made for the Pakistan Stock Exchange. How do you think that's going to help the investor confidence in the country?
I don't think it's because the government. It's just because the investors, they feel that the country maybe the default problem is over, and they're looking for good times. But the other thing is, for years, for almost 6-7 years, the value has been going down. So we are still not there we were in 2018. So everybody sees value in there. That's why the stock market is going up.
Right, of course. Daniyal Sheikh, what's your views on the privatizations of the state-owned enterprises, considering it has been talked about a lot, and this is, I'll give it more of a political angle. It has been talked about a lot, but this is the time when the government seems very determined to go through with it, and especially assets like the PIA, the Pakistan Steel Mills, and of course, as Dr. Manzoor mentioned, the IMF wants all of them privatized. With regards to that, do you think that's going to have any political impact on the country as well?
Well, most certainly, it's like when you take a child to the doctor and he gives him a shot. So obviously, the child develops a hatred for the So I don't want to call the masses short-sighted, but it's a reality. Public is quite short-sighted when it comes to issues like these, and in the past, you know, a lot of our politicians, they have made up this mindset in people that it's state's responsibility to give you jobs. And you know, politicians in their speeches, I gave 30,000 jobs, I gave 50,000 jobs, without realizing where they were putting people. There was no need for that. So ultimately this had to happen. Like PIA, it's so overstaffed, and like other same goes with steel mills, same goes with the other. So they're definitely they're luxuries, but something we cannot afford. So I guess it's high time we need to get rid of this.
Well,
but as far as the revenue for the country is concerned, once the steel mill is being run by some private company or a person, or PIA is being run by some private owner, you'll definitely see a lot more revenue coming in for the country, and you know, they'll be giving a lot more taxes, because PIA, it's got a very loyal client base, because you know, people are people live all over the world, and you know, often I've heard people traveling on PIA from other countries, they say that the moment you get in the plane of PIA, you feel like you're in Pakistan, you feel like you're at home. So you know, most Pakistanis would always prefer to travel with PIA regardless of their horrible service.
Definitely. We hope the service does get better over time. Dr. Usman, will come towards the energy sector. How do you think the energy sector in the country is, because of course Pakistan imports a lot of hydrocarbons for it to function, how do you think the energy sector can have an impact on the economic revival efforts if there's some alternates to the hydrocarbon that we consume?
It's an excellent point that we are too dependent on imported sources, which are also not renewable sources. And I see two important measures here that are very promising. One is that there is a serious push towards renewables in Pakistan. It's mostly private sector adoption, and I'm afraid that some counterproductive policies may forestall that a bit, but I think that the adoption of solar as well as working on hydro and nuclear would be extremely promising so that our energy dependency goes down. I also would like to see further work on our transportation network, because we do import a lot. It's a very significant portion of our import bill, which is basically just for our transport network to work, which it shouldn't. There's far more switching that you can do. And the other thing that is very big in our budget is in terms of like tariff rationalization and subsidies that go to the independent power producers. There has been increasing talk about looking carefully as either contracts with them come to their final term, or that we should simply just pause them as they are, because they are extortionary with their guaranteed returns in dollar-denominated sums. I think that we have to look in terms of the sustainability of our energy sector, which would also ensure the sustainability of our economy. This sustainable thing, rather than this rapid-paced desire for development that we had 30 years ago and then kept going, I think that this has hurt us in the long run. And so having energy, because as you understand, energy is basically the lifeblood of the economy. So taking the energy sector seriously is very important for our economic development. We should do it in a renewable and sustainable manner. There is no rush, and we have to get rid of some things that have created immense distortions in our system. And this budget alludes to that. The IMF press release alludes to that. Now let's see how the work goes on that, because it is a sensitive subject, but a very important one.
Well, definitely a very important one. Dr. Manzoor, your views on the energy sector. How do you think it is draining our reserves, and how do you think the government can tackle it? Do you think there should be more collaboration with regional partners regarding the energy issue? Because energy is something everyone needs to function.
Yes, well, there are 2 or 3 things that are in the offing. I mean, there's Suki Kanaris, I think by the end of this year will be completed, and then Basha Dam is perhaps in a couple of years or 3 years, I don't remember the exact date. So this hydro is, you know, once they start functioning, they're much cheaper because they're not, you don't need any import. Second thing is that the government has already decided not to put up any more generation plants or anything on imported fuel. Right. So if there is anything, they're already converting these to that that mines and send. I mean, the third coal, etc. So that's another thing. And then like alternate energy, you know, solar. Still, luckily, there was a lot of rumors that government is going to put tax, etc. But those, I think, they are still free, and the price is really coming down of solar plates, etc. I mean, where they were just see 5 years ago, just see 2 years ago, and they're coming down. So there's far more, I should say, scope for going further towards this. You can, it's easy to convert. Earlier on, you mentioned about this tube wells. You know, you don't have to carry the wires, and you don't have to do all that. I mean, it's just very simple. So these are some of the solutions. Go towards alternate energy, and then we waste a lot of energy. For example, you know, in summers, our energy requirements goes up very high, and it's because our fans are extremely inefficient. You know, they consume too much electricity. Now the government can, like they did, you know, you remember a few years ago, they did about the bulbs. They used to be very, and then they distributed freely to other people, etc. And over time, they kind of more or less replaced with the other bulbs, which are far more energy efficient. So they need to do very quickly for these fans and such things, so that we don't waste energy.
Dr. Manzoor, that's a very important point that you raised. Daniyal Sheikh, I'd like your comments. How do you think the government can, because you're a political analyst, in your opinion, how do you think the government can ensure this campaign where the people and bring awareness to the masses that they don't waste as much electricity, because the government is focused on generating electricity, but it should also, don't you think, focus on how to save electricity?
Most certainly, electricity and water must be conserved. The way we're wasting it, it's not, obviously that's a very important thing. But before that, you're talking about the generation. I don't think at the moment government is worried about generation. In fact, the thing that they're worried about is to somehow bring FATA and other Malakan division in a uniformed system, that they should be paying the same amount of electricity bills as the rest of the country, but some areas are not even paying anything. Like recently, you know, in Kashmir there was a big issue. They don't want to pay. So, you know, this is a very dangerous precedent. Because in this economic condition, if see, like I said earlier, certain luxuries like giving welfare to the public, you know, it's very good. But if you can afford it, but if you cannot, so, you know, this is something that the government definitely needs to focus on, to somehow bring the whole country into the convincing them to start paying their share of what they're consuming. No?
Definitely. And how do you think about generation? If we talk about how the government should focus on cleaner and greener energy, do you think there should be collaborations with the regional partners in that regard, and more partnerships in the energy sector for electricity or energy generation?
You know, as my personal opinion is now, the government doesn't need to do much. The public sector, most of the industries are already going on to solar, alternative energy. So the government just needs to deal with the power plants that they had built in the past few years, like the Nandipur power plant and the Port Qasim and the Baloki, and there's two coal-fired in Jamshoro, 660 megawatt each. So they've already generated. So they've built so many power plants. What they do need to focus on is the distribution system, because every year we see a trip in the national grid because of the pressure. So that could be something that they need to focus on, and then they need to focus on line losses, how to collect, like I said earlier, the bills on time from people, especially the people who are not cooperating. As far as generation is concerned, I don't think at least in the next few years, it's going to be an issue. Once the projects related to CPAC, once they start, and once those industrial zones that are to be built, once they start operating, because obviously a lot of industries are going to run 24/7, so they cannot just rely on solar. So at that point, yes, they might need to think about putting up more plants, but definitely they have to be friendly to the environment, because we cannot afford.
Definitely, green energy is the way forward.
Definitely.
Dr. Usman, your views on the energy sector when we talk about it. There's the issue of capacity payments and the external debt. How do you think the government can focus on that? And do you think it's something that the government should focus on immediately, or something that should be given a few time for?
Oh, that's a very tricky question, because it is a sensitive subject. In some cases, you know, these things are coming to the end of their contract, so it won't be an issue. For others, they are more recently set up and they are tricky, but I personally believe that they should be, you just pay the penalty and end it, because what you hemorrhage in the longer run is much larger. In the press release that the IMF has issued as part of this new standby agreement, it has pointed out that anything that has a guaranteed return that would distort the investment landscape has to be just not pursued, and I think that's very good. And they also have mentioned that they should be phasing out their incentives to special economic zones. So there are certain clauses in this standby agreements wording that do tell you that the government is expected to take this energy sector a little bit seriously, and just distortions overall and subsidies as a whole has to be taken care of in a much more careful manner. So it seems that the discussions between our government and the IMF already encompass things that are of a pressing nature, such as the energy sector that you have appropriately raised.
Dr. Manzoor, thank you for the insights, Dr. Usman. But Dr. Manzoor, do you think with the extended fund facility, and this is a concluding question because we're running short on time now, with the extended fund facility, a staff level agreement has been reached between Pakistan and the IMF. Do you think the government, what measures should the government take in your view for better transparency in the utilization of these funds?
Well, I mean, you know, it has been identified for a long time that there are 4 or 5 areas that we have discussed already. I mean, energy, SOEs, etc. So this is, for the timing, this is more stabilize the economy, so the government can do all those reforms. Actually, this money is not going into that. It's just that it's meeting the shortfall, because our imports are higher, our exports are much lower. And every year we need something like $20–25 billion for that. So this is more for that purposes. But that gives the government a breathing space for doing other reforms. So that they're not worried about just defaulting or something. So you know. So definitely. I think this,
Daniyal Sheikh, what's your views on how the government can ensure better transparency in the utilization of these funds, especially when we talk about the sectors like the PSDP?
They put a massive cut on the PSDP. In fact, they've shut down PWD. That's where most of the development used to happen to. And I guess this was the need of the hour. We cannot afford this either. Now we're just going to focus on the routine maintenance of the roads, and most of that is done through the revenue collected from the toll plazas. Because at the moment, the government cannot afford the massive public spending that they used to do. So it's a bitter pill that we have to swallow. But the promising, reassuring thing that the Prime Minister committed in the budget was this was the last time we went to IMF, and hopefully once we start reaping some fruits from the CPAC projects, we will be able to come out of this, and then we will be able to make our own decisions. At the moment, just the petroleum levy is literally killing the masses economically. So we're in a very tight situation, and this year is going to be, and the coming year, it's going to be quite difficult. And
well, as the finance minister also mentioned, hopefully it's going to be the last one for the country. With that, we'll have to conclude our show, as that's all the time we have for today. In today's show, we discussed how Pakistan and IMF staff level agreement has been reached. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Dr. Manzoor Ahmed, former ambassador to the World Trade Organization, Daniyal Sheikh, a political analyst, Dr. Usman Chohan, a senior economist. Thank you all for your time and being part of the conversation. Of course, as said earlier, hopefully it's the last one for the country. With that, we'll conclude today's show. See you same time tomorrow. Till then, take care.